She moved quietly between the tables, balancing 2 plates in one hand and a tray of glasses in the other. The restaurant was full, as it always was on weekends. Soft music played in the background, the kind that people barely noticed but somehow made everything feel more expensive. Guests laughed, talked loudly, and leaned back in their chairs as if the world outside did not exist. For her, it was just another long shift. She had learned how to disappear in places like this. Not literally, of course, but in a way that made people overlook her. She arrived, did her work, smiled when needed, and left without leaving a mark. That was how things worked. Customers remembered the food, the lighting, the conversations they had, not the person who brought their drinks. And she preferred it that way. There was something safe about not being noticed. No expectations, no questions, no pressure. Table 6 needs water, someone called from behind the counter. I've got it, she replied softly, already turning before the sentence was finished. Her voice was calm, always calm. Even when she was tired, even when her feet ached from standing all day, she kept that same steady tone. It was part of the job, but it was also part of who she had become. She walked over to the table, filled the glasses, and gave a small polite smile. The guests didn't really look at her. One of them nodded without breaking his conversation. That was normal. She didn't mind. As she turned away, her eyes drifted, just for a second, to the corner of the room. The piano stood there as it always did. It was old, polished enough to shine under the dim lights, but not really used. Most nights, it sat untouched, like a piece of decoration meant to make the place feel more elegant. Sometimes, a hired musician would come and play for an hour or two, but not often. Tonight, it was silent. She slowed her steps just slightly as she passed it. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her to take it in. The smooth black surface. The closed lid. The bench pushed neatly underneath. Something in her chest tightened, the way it always did. She looked away quickly and kept walking. There was no point thinking about it. Can you take this order? Another server asked, holding out a small notepad. She nodded and stepped in without hesitation. Work didn't wait, and neither did the people sitting at the tables. Hours passed like that. Orders, trays, polite smiles, quiet footsteps. The rhythm of the restaurant was something she had memorized long ago. When to move faster, when to slow down, when to speak, and when to stay silent. Every now and then, laughter would rise louder than usual, or a glass would clink sharply against another. The world of the guests felt distant, like something she was watching through a window. But there were moments, small, unexpected moments, when something slipped through. A melody from someone's phone. A few notes hummed absent-mindedly by a guest. Even the faint background music sometimes carried a tone that felt familiar. And each time, her mind would pull her somewhere else. A small room. A simple piano. Fingers pressing down carefully, again and again trying to get it right. Long evenings spent practicing while the rest of the world moved on outside. She blinked, bringing herself back to the present. That life felt very far away now. "Excuse me," a customer said, waving slightly. She stepped forward immediately. "Yes, what can I get for you?" Her voice was gentle, practiced. As she wrote down the order, her thoughts stayed focused. That was something she had trained herself to do. Not just here, but in life. Stay present. Stay practical. Don't get lost in things that can't be changed. It wasn't always easy. There had been a time when everything felt possible. When she believed that the hours spent practicing would lead somewhere. When she thought she might one day sit in front of an audience, not as a server but as someone they came to hear. But life had its own plans. Responsibilities came first. They always did. Bills, family needs, things that couldn't wait. Music slowly became something she visited less and less, until one day, she realized she hadn't touched a piano in months, then years. At first, she told herself it was temporary, that she would return to it when things settled down. But time moved quickly, and the gap grew wider. Eventually, she stopped saying one day. Now, the piano in the corner was just a reminder of something she used to be. She carried another tray to a table near the window. Outside, the city lights flickered softly, and cars moved in steady lines. People inside were dressed in neat clothes, enjoying their evening, unaware of how many small stories were quietly unfolding around them. She placed the dishes carefully and stepped back. "Thank you," one of the guests said briefly. She nodded. As she turned, she caught a reflection of herself in the glass. For a second, she paused. There was nothing unusual about what she saw. Just a server in a simple uniform, hair tied back neatly, expression calm. But behind that calm, there was something else. Something she rarely allowed herself to think about. She looked away. "Hey!" a coworker whispered as they passed each other. "Big reservation coming in soon." She raised an eyebrow slightly. "How big?" "Important people, apparently. Manager's been checking everything twice." She nodded. That explained the extra tension in the air. It happened sometimes. Certain guests brought a different kind of attention. Everything had to be perfect. "Got it," she said. As she moved back toward the main floor, she noticed the manager adjusting the table arrangement, speaking quietly to another staff member. Glasses were being polished again, even though they were already clean. Napkins were folded more carefully than usual. The atmosphere shifted, just a little. She didn't think much of it. For her, it was just another table to serve, another set of guests to take care of. Still, something about the night felt slightly different. Maybe it was the way the lights seemed softer, or the way the room felt just a bit quieter between conversations. Or maybe it was just one of those moments when everything slowed down enough for her to notice things she usually ignored. Her eyes drifted once more to the piano. This time, she didn't look away immediately. She imagined, just for a second, what it would feel like to sit there again. To press the keys, to hear the sound fill the room, to lose herself in something that wasn't about serving tables or keeping up with orders. Her fingers moved slightly, almost as if remembering the shape of the keys. Then a voice cut through her thoughts. "Can you help set up the front table?" She blinked and turned. "Yes, of course." The moment passed just like that. She walked toward the entrance area, focusing on the task in front of her. Plates, glasses, chairs, everything needed to be just right. As she worked, she pushed the feeling aside. That was something she had learned to do well. Keep moving forward. Don't stop too long in places that pull you back. Still, somewhere deep inside, a small part of her held onto that memory. Not loudly, not in a way that demanded attention, just quietly, like a melody waiting to be played again. The front doors opened a little wider than usual, and the quiet rhythm of the restaurant shifted almost instantly. It wasn't loud at first, just a small change in the way people moved and looked around. The staff near the entrance straightened their posture. The manager stepped forward with a polite smile that looked more careful than before. She noticed it while placing cutlery on a table. The important guests had arrived. A group of well-dressed people walked in, their presence filling the space without needing to say much. Conversations nearby softened, and a few heads turned. It wasn't unusual for wealthy customers to come here, but this felt different. There was a certain energy, something sharper, like everyone was suddenly more aware of themselves. She kept working, but her eyes lifted for a brief second. At the center of the group was a man who seemed to carry most of the attention. He didn't raise his voice or make any big gestures, yet people reacted to him immediately. The manager greeted him with extra respect, leading the group toward the large table near the center. She looked away and continued setting the table in front of her. It didn't matter who they were. For her, it meant more work, more orders, more careful steps. That was all. Still, she couldn't ignore how the mood of the room had changed. "Stay sharp," a coworker whispered as they passed by her. "They expect everything perfect." She gave a small nod. "Always do." But even as she said it, she could feel the tension rising slightly in her shoulders. Not fear, not exactly, just the quiet pressure that came with being watched more closely than usual. The group settled into their seats, their conversations starting almost immediately. Their voices were confident, relaxed, the kind of tone that came from people used to being listened to. Glasses were filled, menus were opened, and the first orders began. She approached the table with steady steps, her expression calm. "Good evening," she said gently. "Can I get you something to drink?" A few of them looked up, but most continued their conversation. One person listed off a few drinks quickly, barely pausing. She wrote everything down carefully, making sure not to miss anything. As she stood there, she felt his eyes on her, the man at the center. It wasn't uncomfortable, just noticeable. When she finished writing, she glanced up briefly. He was watching her with a small, thoughtful expression, as if trying to figure something out. She looked away almost immediately and gave a polite nod. "I'll be right back with your drinks." She turned and walked toward the counter, her pace unchanged. Behind her, the conversations continued, but something about that brief moment stayed with her. She couldn't explain it, and she didn't try to. There was no reason to. She focused on preparing the drinks instead. Minutes later, she returned to the table, placing each glass carefully in front of the guests. Everything was smooth, practiced, precise. She didn't rush, but she didn't linger either. Just as she finished, one of the guests laughed loudly at something, the sound cutting through the room. Others joined in, their voices rising. Then, suddenly, a different voice spoke. "Do you ever use that piano?" The question seemed to come out of nowhere. For a second, she didn't realize it was directed at her. She looked up, slightly confused. "I'm sorry." The man gestured lightly toward the corner of the room, where the piano stood. "That one. Does anyone actually play it?" She followed his gaze, her eyes landing on the familiar shape. Her chest tightened again. "It's sometimes used," she said carefully. "Mostly for special evenings." He leaned back slightly, still looking in that direction. "Seems like a waste otherwise." A few people at the table glanced over, mildly curious. She gave a small polite smile. "It adds to the atmosphere." He let out a quiet breath, almost like a short laugh. Atmosphere is one thing, but instruments are meant to be played. She didn't respond. It wasn't her place to argue, and she wasn't even sure why the conversation felt different from the usual small talk she heard every day. But before she could step away, someone else at the table spoke up. "I think she plays." The words were casual, almost offhand, but they landed heavily. She froze for just a fraction of a second. "What?" another guest asked. "I heard one of the staff mention it earlier," the person continued. "She knows how to play." Her grip tightened slightly around the tray in her hand. She hadn't expected that. The man at the center turned his attention back to her, more directly this time. "Is that true?" There was a pause. She could feel the eyes at the table shift toward her, one by one. It wasn't harsh or judgmental, just curious, but it was enough. She shook her head lightly, keeping her voice steady. "Not really. It's been a long time." "That's not what I asked," he said, still calm. "Can you play?" The room around them seemed to fade slightly, the background noise becoming distant. She hesitated. "Yes," she said quietly. "But I don't, not anymore." A small silence followed. Then he smiled, not in a mocking way, but in a way that suggested he had made up his mind about something. "Well," he said, "that sounds like something we should fix." Her heart skipped slightly. "I'm sorry?" she asked. "You should play," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The words hung in the air. She felt a sudden wave of discomfort, stronger than anything she had felt that evening. This wasn't part of her job. This wasn't something she was prepared for. "I don't think that would be appropriate," she replied gently. "I'm working." A few people at the table exchanged looks, some amused, some curious. He didn't seem bothered by her response. "It's just a song," he said. "A few minutes." She shook her head again, a little more firmly this time. "I'm sorry, I really can't." For a moment, it seemed like the conversation might end there. But then he leaned forward slightly, his tone still calm but more direct. "I insist." The word settled heavily. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it carried weight. She felt it immediately. Around the table, the others grew quieter, watching the exchange with interest. Some smiled faintly, as if expecting something entertaining. Her mind raced. This was exactly the kind of attention she avoided. Being put on the spot, being asked to step out of the quiet space she had built for herself. It felt overwhelming. "I'm not prepared," she said softly. It's been years. That doesn't matter, he replied. Talent doesn't just disappear. She didn't know what to say to that, because a part of her wondered if he was right. But another part of her, the part that had spent years staying invisible, pushed back. I really should get back to work, she said, trying to step away. But his voice followed her. Think about it. She paused just for a second. Then she nodded slightly and walked away. Her steps felt different now. Not unsteady, but heavier. Like each movement carried something extra. Behind her, the conversations at the table slowly picked up again. But the energy had changed. She reached the counter and set the tray down carefully. Everything okay? A coworker asked quietly. She hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, just busy. But it wasn't just that. Her thoughts kept circling back to the piano, to the question, to the way he had said, you should play. She glanced across the room again. The piano sat there, silent as ever. But now it didn't feel like just part of the background anymore. Felt like something waiting. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure she could ignore it. She tried to focus on her work, but it was getting harder with every passing minute. Orders came in, plates went out, glasses needed refilling. Everything moved as it always did. But her mind wasn't fully there anymore. A part of her kept drifting back to that moment at the table. The question, the insistence, the way all eyes had suddenly turned toward her. She had spent years avoiding exactly that kind of attention. Can you grab table 4? Someone called. She nodded quickly. On it. She picked up a tray and walked across the floor, keeping her posture steady. From the outside, nothing had changed. She still moved with the same calm rhythm, the same quiet confidence people expected from her. But inside, something felt unsettled. As she approached the table, she could feel it again, that faint pull toward the corner of the room. The piano. It seemed closer now, even though it hadn't moved at all. She forced herself not to look. Here you go, she said, placing the plates down carefully. Thank you, one of the guests replied, smiling. She nodded and stepped away, but her thoughts kept circling. It had been years. Years since her fingers last touched those keys. Years since she had allowed herself to sit down and just play without thinking about anything else. Back then, it had been different. Music wasn't something she questioned. It was something she lived with every day. She remembered long evenings where time seemed to disappear, where the only thing that mattered was getting a piece right, feeling each note, each pause. She used to lose herself in it. Now, even the idea of sitting at a piano in front of people made her chest tighten. What if she couldn't do it anymore? What if everything she once knew was gone? She shook her head slightly, trying to clear her thoughts. It didn't matter. She had already said no. That should have been the end of it. But something about the way he had spoken stayed with her. You should play. Not can you. Not would you like to. You should. It wasn't a suggestion. Felt like a decision made for her. She reached the counter and picked up another order, her movements a little sharper now. Hey, her coworker said quietly. What was that about earlier? She glanced over. What do you mean? That table, they said, nodding subtly toward the group. They were asking about you. She paused. Just a question about the piano, she said, trying to keep it simple. Her coworker raised an eyebrow. And nothing, she replied quickly. I said no. There was a brief silence. You play? The coworker asked, more curious now. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. I used to. Why didn't you tell anyone? She shrugged lightly. Didn't seem important. Her coworker looked like they wanted to say more, but then someone called their name, and they moved away. She stood there for a second, holding the tray, feeling the weight of that short conversation. It wasn't something she talked about. Not here. Not anywhere, really. Because once you start talking about something like that, people ask questions. And questions lead to explanations. And explanations lead to expectations. And she didn't want that. She preferred things simple. But tonight didn't feel simple anymore. She glanced across the room again, this time unable to stop herself. The group at the center table was still there, still talking, still surrounded by that quiet sense of importance. And he was there too, leaning back in his chair, listening to someone speak. For a moment, it seemed like he wasn't paying attention to anything else. Then, almost as if he felt her gaze, he looked up. Their eyes met. She quickly looked away, her heart beating a little faster. That was enough. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, trying to put distance between herself and that moment. Inside, the noise was louder, more chaotic. Plates clattered, voices overlapped, orders were called out quickly. It should have helped distract her, but it didn't. Her thoughts followed her in. She set the tray down and leaned slightly against the counter, just for a second. "Everything okay?" someone asked. "Yeah," she replied, straightening up immediately. "Just a long shift." That wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. She stepped back out onto the floor, the noise fading again into the softer sounds of the dining area. And then she heard it. A single note. It was faint, almost uncertain, but it was there. She froze. Her eyes moved instantly to the piano. One of the guests, someone from a different table, had walked over and pressed a key lightly, testing the sound. It echoed softly through the room, drawing a few curious glances. Then they laughed and stepped away, leaving the piano silent again. But that one note lingered in her mind. It was enough to bring everything rushing back. The feeling of sitting at the bench, the weight of her hands on the keys, the way a simple note could grow into something bigger, something full. Her fingers twitched slightly at her side. She didn't even realize it at first. "Hey!" a voice said behind her. She turned. It was the manager. "They're asking again," he said quietly. Her stomach tightened. "Who?" she asked, even though she already knew. "The center table," he replied. "They want you to play something." She stared at him for a moment. "I already said I can't," she said softly. "I know," he said. "But they're insisting." The word again. Insisting. She felt a mix of frustration and unease rise inside her. "This isn't part of my job," she said. Her voice still calm but firmer now. The manager sighed lightly. "I understand. But they're important guests. It would be good for the restaurant." There it was. Not a command, not exactly, but close enough. She looked down for a second, her mind racing. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the place she worked, the people she worked with. Saying no again might create a problem she didn't want. But saying yes, she wasn't sure she could handle that. "What if I mess up?" she asked quietly. The manager gave a small shrug. "Then you mess up. It's just a piano. Just a piano." If only it felt that simple. She let out a slow breath. Around her, the restaurant continued as usual. People eating, talking, laughing. No one knew what was going on inside her head. No one knew how much this small moment meant. "I need a minute," she said. The manager nodded. "Take it." She stepped away, moving toward the side of the room where things were a little quieter. Her eyes found the piano again. It didn't look intimidating. It didn't look like something that could change anything. And yet, it felt like standing in front of a door she had kept closed for years. If she walked away now, nothing would change. She would finish her shift, go home, and tomorrow would be just another day. Safe, predictable, quiet. But if she sat down, everything might feel different. Her heart beat a little faster. She thought about all the reasons to say no. The fear, the uncertainty, the possibility of failing in front of a room full of people. Then, slowly, she thought about something else. The sound of music filling a space. The feeling of her hands moving freely again. The part of herself she had left behind. She closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them, her decision still wasn't fully clear. But something inside her had shifted. Not completely. Not enough to erase the fear, but enough to make her hesitate a little longer before walking away. And sometimes that was where everything began. She stood there a little longer than she realized. The noise of the restaurant continued around her. Soft conversations, clinking glasses, footsteps moving back and forth. but it all felt distant now, like she was standing slightly outside of it, watching instead of being part of it. Her eyes stayed on the piano. It hadn't changed. It was still the same quiet object sitting in the corner, polished and untouched. But the way she saw it had changed completely. It no longer felt like decoration. It felt like a question. Are you going to do this or not? She swallowed slowly. Her hands felt a little cold. Behind her, she could sense movement. Staff passing by, guests shifting in their seats. And somewhere in the room, she knew that Table was still watching, still waiting. She took a small breath, then another. And before she could overthink it again, she turned and began walking toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than it should have. Not because the distance was long, but because of what it meant. Every step forward felt like leaving something safe behind. The quiet, invisible role she had built for herself over the years. People started to notice. It happened slowly at first. A few glances. A slight pause in conversation. Someone nudging the person next to them. Is someone going to play? She heard a whisper as she passed one table. Her heart beat faster. She kept walking. When she finally reached the piano, she stopped. Up close, it looked even more familiar. The smooth surface. The faint marks on the bench. The keys hidden beneath the closed lid. For a moment, she just stood there. Her reflection looked back at her from the polished surface. Same uniform, same tied-back hair, same calm face. But her eyes looked different now. More uncertain. More exposed. She reached out slowly and lifted the lid. The soft sound of it opening seemed louder than it should have been. A few more voices in the room faded. She pulled the bench out and sat down carefully. The moment she did, everything felt real. There was no stepping back now. Her hands rested lightly in her lap. She didn't touch the keys yet. She wasn't ready. Not quite. She could feel the room behind her. The attention. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was there. A quiet shift in the air, like people were holding their breath without realizing it. She closed her eyes for a second. Just 1 second. And in that moment, everything came rushing back. The small room she used to practice in. The feeling of sitting like this, hands ready, mind focused. The way music used to come naturally, like it was part of her. She had missed this, more than she allowed herself to admit. Her fingers moved slightly, hovering over the keys. Then she opened her eyes. For a brief second, doubt hit her again. What if she couldn't do it? What if the first note sounded wrong? What if she froze? Her hands trembled just a little. But then she remembered something simple. It didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be honest. She lowered her hands. Her fingers touched the keys. The contact alone sent a small wave through her chest. It felt familiar in a way that surprised her. Like her hands remembered something her mind had forgotten. She pressed the first note. It was soft, careful, almost hesitant. The sound floated into the room, gentle but clear. A few conversations stopped completely. She pressed another note, then another. Slowly, a simple melody began to form. At first, it wasn't anything impressive. Just a series of notes played carefully, like she was testing the ground beneath her feet. Her breathing was shallow, her shoulders slightly tense. But she didn't stop. Her fingers moved again, and something shifted. It was small at first, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. The hesitation started to fade. Her hands became steadier. The notes began to connect more smoothly. The melody grew. She leaned forward just slightly, her focus narrowing to the keys in front of her. The room behind her began to disappear from her awareness. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about the music. Her fingers moved with more confidence now, sliding from one note to the next without pause. The melody deepened, carrying more emotion, more weight. She wasn't thinking about what to play anymore. She was feeling it. The years between now and the last time she played began to blur. Muscle memory took over. Her posture changed without her realizing it. Her back straightened. Her shoulders relaxed. Her hands moved freely now, no longer stiff or unsure. The music filled the space. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It had presence. carried something real, something that reached beyond the notes themselves. At one table, a man who had been mid-conversation slowly stopped speaking. His words faded as he turned his head toward the sound. At another, a woman lowered her glass halfway to her lips, her eyes shifting toward the piano. Even the staff began to slow down. Trays were held a little longer. Steps became quieter. The room was changing, and she felt it, not in a way that distracted her, but in a way that added to the moment. Her playing grew stronger. The melody rose, then softened, then rose again. There was a story in it. Not one with words, but one that people could feel. Her fingers moved faster now, but still controlled. Each note had purpose. Each pause had meaning. She wasn't holding back anymore. Everything she had kept buried for years, the frustration, the longing, the quiet hope, it all found its way into the music. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't hiding. She didn't notice when the entire room fell silent. She didn't notice the way people leaned slightly forward in their seats. She didn't notice the man at the center table watching her with a completely different expression than before. Because she was gone from that space. Not physically, but mentally, emotionally. She was somewhere else. Somewhere familiar. Somewhere she hadn't allowed herself to return to until now. Her hands moved across the keys with ease now, the earlier hesitation completely gone. The melody reached its peak. Full, rich, and alive. Then slowly, gently, it began to come down. The notes softened. Her fingers slowed. The final part of the piece unfolded with quiet control, like a deep breath after something intense. And then, one last note. It lingered in the air for a moment, then faded. Her hands stayed on the keys for a second longer. Still, quiet. She didn't move. She didn't turn around. For a brief moment, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Just silence. And in that silence, something had changed. The silence stayed for a moment longer than anyone expected. It wasn't empty or awkward. It felt full, like something was still hanging in the air even after the last note had faded. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire room needed a second to understand what had just happened. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys. Her fingers felt warm now, no longer stiff or unsure. Her breathing was deeper, steadier. But she still didn't turn around. Not yet. Part of her didn't want to break the moment. For those few seconds, she wasn't a server. She wasn't someone trying to stay unnoticed. She was just herself. Then it came. A single clap, clear and sharp. It broke through the silence like a signal. Another clap followed. Then another. And suddenly, the entire room came alive. Applause filled the space, louder than anything that had been heard that night. It wasn't polite or forced. It was real, strong, unfiltered. People stood up from their chairs. Some smiled widely. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A few even laughed softly, like they couldn't quite process what they had just heard. She blinked, finally turning around. The sight caught her off guard. Every table, every person, all eyes were on her now. But this time it felt different. It didn't feel like pressure. It felt like recognition. She stood up slowly from the bench, unsure of what to do with her hands. For a second, she just held them together in front of her, almost like she was trying to ground herself. The applause didn't stop. She gave a small, uncertain nod, her expression calm but her eyes slightly overwhelmed. She wasn't used to this. Not anymore. Across the room, she saw her co-workers staring at her. Some smiling, some wide-eyed. One of them even gave her a small thumbs up, clearly impressed. Near the center table, the group that had asked her to play was reacting in their own way. Some were clapping loudly. Others leaned back, exchanging looks that said, "Did you expect that?" And then there was him, the man who had insisted. He wasn't clapping at first. He was just watching her. But his expression had changed completely. The earlier confidence, the casual control, it had softened. There was something else there now. Something quieter. Something closer to respect. Then, slowly, he began to clap as well. Not loudly, but steadily. She held his gaze for just a second before looking away. Her heart was still beating faster than usual, but not from fear anymore. From something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of being seen. The applause slowly began to settle, though a few people kept clapping a little longer than the rest. As the sound faded, the room didn't go back to normal right away. People were still looking at her. Still processing. She stepped away from the piano, unsure of where to go next. For a moment, she considered slipping back into her usual routine, picking up a tray, returning to work like nothing had happened. But before she could move, someone approached her. A woman from one of the nearby tables. "That was beautiful," she said, her voice genuine. "I didn't expect that at all." She gave a small smile. "Thank you. Do you play professionally?" the woman asked. She hesitated. "No, I haven't played in a long time." The woman looked surprised. "Really? It didn't feel like that." She didn't know how to respond to that. Before she could think of something, another person joined. "You should be on a stage, not carrying plates," he said with a light laugh. She smiled politely but didn't answer. More people began to approach, one after another, each with something to say. "That was incredible. I've never heard anything like that here. You have real talent." The words came from all directions. Kind, genuine, unexpected. She listened, nodded, thanked them. But inside, she felt a mix of emotions she couldn't fully sort out. Gratitude, of course, but also confusion, because just an hour ago, none of these people had noticed her at all. And now, suddenly, they were looking at her like she was someone important. Felt strange. Not bad, just unfamiliar. Eventually, the small crowd around her began to thin as people returned to their tables. The restaurant slowly started to find its rhythm again, though it wasn't quite the same as before. There was a different energy now. She took a step back, giving herself a moment to breathe. Then she heard a voice. "You see." She turned. It was him. He had left his table and was now standing a few steps away from her. Up close, his presence felt less overwhelming than before. Or maybe she just felt different now. "I told you," he continued, his tone calm. "Talent doesn't disappear." She looked at him, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," she said finally, keeping her voice simple. He studied her for a moment. "You didn't want to do it," he said. It wasn't a question. She shook her head slightly. "No." "Why?" The question was direct, but not harsh. She thought for a second. "Because it's not who I am anymore," she said quietly. He raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it?" She didn't answer right away, because she wasn't sure. A few minutes ago, sitting at that piano, it had felt exactly like who she was. But standing here now, in her uniform, surrounded by tables and conversations, it felt distant again. "I don't know," she admitted. He nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense to him. "You should think about it," he said. She gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I will." There was a brief pause. Then, without making a big gesture, he reached into his pocket and placed something on the nearby table. A card. "I don't usually do this," he said. But that was worth more than just applause. She looked at the card, then back at him. "I'm not asking for anything," he added. "Just don't ignore what you can do." His tone was different now, less commanding, more sincere. She picked up the card slowly, not fully sure what it meant, but understanding that it mattered. "Thank you," she said again. He gave a small nod, then turned and walked back to his table. She stood there for a moment, holding the card in her hand. Around her, the restaurant continued, but it felt different now. Not just because of what had happened, but because of what it had stirred inside her. She looked once more at the piano. It was quiet again. Still. But it didn't feel distant anymore. It felt close. Like something she could reach for. Something she had already reached for. And maybe something she didn't have to let go of again. The night didn't end the way she expected. After the applause faded and people slowly returned to their meals, she stood there for a few seconds longer, the small card still in her hand. It felt light, but at the same time it carried a strange kind of weight. Not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. Possibility. Something she hadn't allowed herself to think about in years. She slipped the card into her pocket carefully, almost as if it might disappear if she didn't. "Hey!" a coworker said as they walked up to her, still looking amazed. "What was that?" She gave a small, quiet smile. "I guess I remembered how to play." "That wasn't just remembering," they replied. "That was something else." She didn't argue. She didn't agree either. She just nodded slightly and picked up a tray. There was still work to do, and somehow that felt important. Not because nothing had changed, but because everything had. She moved between the tables again, but this time people noticed her differently. Some smiled when she passed. A few gave small nods of appreciation. One table even clapped softly as she walked by, making her pause for a second before continuing. Felt strange, but not uncomfortable, just new. She didn't rush through her tasks now. Her steps were steady, but lighter somehow. The weight she had been carrying earlier, the quiet pressure, the hesitation, it had eased. Not completely gone, but different. When she passed by the piano again, she didn't avoid looking at it. She glanced at it briefly, and this time, instead of feeling something tighten inside her, she felt something open. The rest of the shift went by faster than usual. The important guests eventually finished their meal. Their table grew quieter, then slowly emptied as they prepared to leave. As they stood up, a few of them looked toward her again, offering polite smiles or small gestures of acknowledgement. The man who had spoken to her earlier didn't say anything more. He simply gave her a short nod as he walked past. It was enough. When the doors closed behind them, the restaurant began to settle into its usual rhythm again. The late-night crowd was smaller, quieter. Staff started clearing tables, stacking plates, preparing for closing. She moved along with them, doing what needed to be done. But inside, her thoughts were still turning. Not in a rushed or overwhelming way. Just slowly, carefully, as if something important was being rearranged. "Almost done," someone called from the back. She nodded. "Yeah." She carried the last set of dishes into the kitchen and set them down gently. The noise back there had softened too. Fewer orders, fewer voices. Just the sounds of cleaning and closing. When everything was finished, she stepped outside. The night air felt cool, fresh. She took a deep breath. The street was quieter now, with only a few cars passing by. Lights from nearby buildings glowed softly, and the world felt slower than it had just a few hours ago. She stood there for a moment, letting it all settle. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket and took out the card. She looked at it under the streetlight. A name, a number, nothing complicated. But it didn't feel simple. She turned it over in her hand, thinking, what would happen if she called? What would it lead to? She didn't know, and that uncertainty used to stop her. But tonight had been different. Tonight, she had done something she thought she couldn't do anymore. She had sat down in front of a room full of people and played. Not perfectly, not carefully planned, but honestly, and it had mattered. That thought stayed with her. She slipped the card back into her pocket. Not as something she had to act on right away, but as something she didn't want to ignore. She started walking. Each step felt steady. Not rushed, not hesitant. Just forward. As she moved down the quiet street, her mind drifted back to the moment at the piano. The first note, the hesitation, the way everything changed after that. She smiled slightly to herself. It wasn't about the applause. It wasn't about the attention. It was about that feeling. The one she had almost forgotten. The one that made everything else fade away. She had missed that more than she realized. And now that she had felt it again, she wasn't sure she could go back to pretending it didn't matter. The next day came like any other. Morning light, simple routines, the usual rhythm of life. But something inside her had shifted. She noticed it in small ways. The way she paused a little longer when she heard music. The way her fingers moved lightly against surfaces, as if remembering the shape of keys. The way her thoughts returned, again and again, to that moment. Later that afternoon, she found herself standing near a small shop window. Inside there was a piano. Not large or grand, Just simple, but enough. She stood there for a moment, looking at it. Not with hesitation, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity. A few days ago, she might have walked past without stopping. Now she didn't. She didn't go inside. Not yet. But she didn't turn away immediately either. That, in itself, felt like a step. Back at the restaurant that evening, things were normal again. Orders, conversations, movement. But the piano in the corner felt different. Not distant. Not unreachable. Just waiting. As she worked, a coworker leaned in slightly. "Are you going to play again?" She glanced at the piano, then back at them. "Maybe," she said. It wasn't a promise. But it wasn't a refusal either. And that mattered. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't closing the door on that part of herself. She was leaving it open. Just enough. And sometimes that's how new beginnings start. Not with big decisions or sudden changes, but with small moments. A single note. Quiet choice. A step forward into something uncertain but meaningful. As the evening continued, she moved through the restaurant like she always had. But she wasn't invisible anymore. Not to others. And not to herself. And that made all the difference.